Welcome back to Freeform, the independent little podcast that I've been doing on a monthly basis to try and talk about issues and subjects that I'm hoping will be of interest to you that are outside the norm of a Welsh history podcast. This time, we're going to talk a little bit about my journey through family history and specifically my recent attempt to do some genealogy via DNA testing, how that went, what the results were, and kind of how that process generally will work for you if you decide to do it, and the cautions that come with it. So those are good to know as well. So let's start off with talking about family history. My interest in family history, much like my interest in history in general, is something that started a very long time ago when I was a young man. I was introduced to my family tree by my mom because she had been collecting both her side and my dad's side, who is the Welsh side, obviously with a Williams last name. That kind of is a giveaway. And she had done a bit of research in the 70s, trying to figure out kind of who's where. She talked to some of the old relatives in Wales to kind of gather some names and some dates and maybe locations. And the one thing we know from this initial search, because it was all done via phone calls and letters specifically, that some of it is based on foggy memory. And as we've talked about in the past, memory can be a bit of a problem because it has a tendency to get fuzzy as time goes on, and stories that families tell each other about themselves and about their lives don't always match up with the reality of the circumstance and the situation. So that's something to be aware of. One of the famous things from my wife's family is they tell a story about a incident with a bear and a gun, and how in a old settler's cabin they had a bear attack. So the bear was attacking this log cabin home. Like I said, there was an incident where they shot at the bear, and I honestly don't remember if the story went that they killed it or what exactly happened. But the one thing I do know about it all is when I researched it actually later, it never happened, and that the story was complete fiction that was told amongst the family members because somebody somewhere remembered it that way, but it turned out not to be true. There was never any situation like that, and that all of the discussion points about it that happened when the incident happened and it was recorded had nothing to do with what was written down by a great-great-grandmother many years later in her 70s talking about something that happened when she was like 14. And so that's something to always keep in mind when you're doing family history. Stuff can be a little bit sketchy, and family stories are great, but you have to keep in mind that they sometimes can be a little bit taken on faith by family members when maybe it doesn't actually happen that way. Maybe the idea that you're related to a Native American, for example, isn't actually true. Maybe this idea that you had a famous uncle or great uncle who came into all this money and disappeared isn't actually how it worked. And maybe the family just lost contact with them. So there's lots of things that can happen and do happen in family history, which we don't fully get. One of the biggest things that we find when I'm doing research is that I know my mother got very confused about the idea that you would name your house and that would be a part of the address. So in Britain and in Europe in general, it's common enough that houses have names attached to them. For us, it was a place called Franolu, which I'm probably mispronouncing badly, but that basically translates into I think it's let there be light or light on a bushel. I don't remember. It's been a while since I looked at it, but it was a Quaker religious thing. And apparently it was a popular name to reuse in houses, because I've actually found it in a couple of other houses that have nothing to do with this particular family and in totally different locations. But that was the house name. But for my mother, she thought that was a place name. So it got very confusing, and she had to kind of figure that out. And that is something to be aware of when you're looking at these kind of things. The other little trick, which I found out later that kind of threw me off, when you're looking in transcript records, the older they go, especially in England and Wales, the weirder they get in how they're written. Like, if I'm to put it bluntly, in the Victorian period, they knew what tables were and they used them. So you had name of person, what happened when, to whom. I'll use my own name just to make this simple. John Williams, married August 18th, 1995, to this person from this person, and this person were his parents. So that's kind of how it would work. And it was very easy to tell who was who and where they were from and where they were. Because the other thing they would include usually is, what house they came from. So those things are very easy, and they start to become normal in the 1800s, about the same time that they're doing censuses, which also have a tabular format. And censuses start in the early 1800s. So it makes it easy to track things down, because you can kind of verify, okay, we think the house they lived in, did they live there at this point in time? And because you have a 10-year period around the, imagine there's a census done in 1901, there's one in 1911. Well, there's also one in 1891, 1881, 1871, 1860. So you can go back and you can look and kind of trace a family as they live in an area. So if they've lived in that place long enough, you're able to track quite a long way back, and you can see when things have changed, especially in the family membership, and in some cases where the family membership has changed the ownership of the house. So for example, in one of my family lines, this same house, in fact, the transition of the house went to the oldest daughter, and so the house would continue through the daughter, even as her last name changes, she would marry. And so it went from like Roberts and Ellis and Jones and, so it would go through all these variations. Roberts and Williams, I think, were in there at some point. And you would see that transition, but you knew based on the older census what was going on. Well, then to verify that, you go into something called transcripts. And there is a record that there was of this little village from a local church, a local Anglican, or Church in Wales church to be more precise, but it's an Anglican church, which is called the Bishop's Transcripts of Frew. And Frew was, as I said, a small little hamlet in the mountains, and it was, or hills, depending on your point of view, and it was very much a small community which just didn't change. People lived there for ages, and so this house effectively was in one hand, in one family line, from the 1700s up to about at least the late 1800s, early 1900s, I believe. I think my grandmother was born there, so early 1900s, we'll say. So you have this family tracing that you can do through that. So it's very, very nice when you can find that. And then you use the transcripts to back up everything because of course you don't know if you get a census and it matches up by name, especially in Wales, where there are only certain amounts of last names for a long time. It's a lot easier to sort of say, okay, well, this is so-and-so Jones. Well, is that actually so-and-so Jones, or is that so-and-so a totally different Jones? And so you have to kind of go back and look into, so you go through the census, you see the common denominator, then you go into things like bishop's transcripts or birth, marriage, death indexes, and you can get that information. And the good thing about places like the National Library in Aberystwyth is that they do have some of this. I've actually seen, and I've mentioned this probably in the past, the actual records from the bishop's transcripts of Frew. And I have actually made digital copies, I should say, of some of it, because worryingly, from my first visit in 1999 to 2011, when I went there the second time, I was noticing decay coming, probably because there was a lot of people looking at these records consistently. And even more worryingly for me was that the microfilm that was taken of it in many, many years prior to that, which is the only other record that I knew about before the digital copies, they also weren't very good. They weren't very clear. Anything with certain kinds of ink didn't really show very well, so that became a bit of an issue too. So you have this common problem, and be aware, if you get a microfilm of these kind of things and you're looking at it and it's blank, like basically it looks like a white sheet, or it looks like very, very faint, it's probably because the ink has been fading, and the ink, as it fades, goes into a lighter brown color, which can be very hard to read when it's taken by microfilm or microfiche, which is the other option. Some of you will not know what that is, but let me just put it this way. It's like looking at old film, and it, because it was taken many, many years ago, sometimes isn't taken very well. So you hope that over time they've digitalized them and then at least preserve them that way. I mean, respectively, you want them to preserve the original record, but if you can't keep that record alive because it's slowly decomposing, because the other slight problem is that paper wasn't very high quality at this point, then that's something you're going to have to be aware of and be cognizant that records will start to decompose. So to add to all this fun, the other thing that starts to happen as you go back into the records, specifically once you get back into about the 17 and especially into the 1600s, the other thing you see is the language start to change and the way things are written down start to change. So you go from very easy to see and understand tables to paragraphs to page. And it's just a page of written, so-and-so died at such and such a place, and so-and-so was married at such and such a place, and and it would just, and there's not necessarily even any periods, because in the time period, they know where the periods are, so they understand what they're writing. We don't. And then it goes from English into some form of Latin for no reason that I can discern initially. It just does. And it turns out the reason why it does is because the Latin of the era had become a fad, and they started to use it even though they were in a Reformation church. So they start to use Latin again just out of the blue, and it only happens for a while, and it may have only been one writer who basically was the guy tabulating all this information, was just very much into Latin. And they weren't Catholic or anything like that, so it's nothing to do with that. It's just strictly that there was this idea that Latin was a great way to keep track of things. So they would write in Latin, and so all of a sudden now you have to be a translator. So those are kind of the things that can affect kind of your research and how you're looking for stuff. And for me, that really made things tricky, because you're starting to try and find stuff out, and it's hard to get back to a certain point. And sites like Ancestry and others that kind of have clues can be helpful, but they're dangerous because sometimes the clues are completely wrong, because it's making a guess based on some of your information, and sometimes those guesses are not correct. So you have to be very aware of that, and you have to double check. So there you go. That's kind of an overview. I am not a professional genealogist. There are genealogists who do this for a living. They're definitely, if you're stumped, hiring one of them may be very helpful. I don't really know. I've never done that myself, but it's something to look into because it may or may not be helpful to you. So be aware of that, because there's no reason why, if you really want to get to a certain point, you couldn't use a professional genealogist. They are trained. They have access to all the libraries typically, or at least to the digital information, and know how to find stuff. So that's where they're helpful. So if you're sitting there in the 1600s and you're trying to track some stuff down, it's important that you may want to access people like that. The other thing to be aware of too is that once you get past that point, everything is to be taken with a complete grain of salt. There's no guarantee that any sort of reality will be found in genealogies that are older than 1500, because the reality of them is they have a tendency to fib. First off, if you've ever seen Knight's Tale, I would recommend that movie because it's kind of a lot of fun, where they make up his lineage and they completely make it up from scratch. Both times, by the way, because originally the group that's trying to do this lies, and then the king, or sorry, the prince, is it Prince Henry? I think it's Prince Henry, then lies as well and makes it up because he finds an old record that tells of a tale of this one being descended from ancient kings, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's all garbage, but it's so common in this era, especially. I mean, I found it myself. I mean, there's lots of family trees which go back to completely ahistorical characters. people we know are fictional, or people that are straight up mythology. I mean, my wife's ancestry goes into Thor and Odin, for heaven's sakes. So you have to be aware of that, and like Tutankhamun and all over the place. Basically, anybody who had, well, it wasn't Tutankhamun because it was too long ago, but like that kind of pharaoh level. I mean, they just go all over the map, and it's like whoever was kind of cool, somebody wrote down. So all of these things be aware of. Anything I suggest beyond the 1500s is for fun. I mean, let's be honest. Outside of the kings, you really don't really have a record of most of them anyway. But they're only for fun at that point. After that, it's sketchy because the records are not complete, because they're completely based on believing someone who may or may not be telling you the truth. And you have to understand that. Again, going back into my wife's genealogy, because they go into one set of kings, she's also apparently related to Jesus Christ. So there you go. She's got gods coming out of the everywhere. So be aware of that. That's kind of one of those things, I guess I would say, is understand they're not going to be accurate past a certain point. Recognize that and accept that, and be happy with what you can find, because some of it's great and you'll find details you never knew about. So now that's kind of my precursor to what I was going to talk about. So when I was about a decade ago, my sister had decided to do some DNA work with, I think, my dad. And so she proceeded to do it. And the one problem I found now is that those records, I don't know where they are. And this is going to be an issue for you if you're having other relatives do stuff. Keep in mind that the access to that information is completely on the login of the person who's creating the DNA records check. And if they don't share any information with you other than telling you verbally, or in my case, showing you an image of it on an iPad and never sending you any copies of it, you may never find it again, because if something happens to that person, it can have dire consequences. So for me, what ended up happening is shortly after she did this with my dad passed away. My mom passed away a few years later, and my sister passed away a couple of years after that. So within a short amount of time, all of these records and all of this information is just gone, and nobody has access to any of it. And yeah, you might be able to get it back if you go with a certain amount of information to Ancestry or whoever the DNA people are, and say, look, so-and-so's passed away. Here's the death certificate. I need access to the login. And you can get access to it, but it is a lot of work if you're not one of the executors and don't actually have that as your information. So keep that in mind, because if you have an executor that isn't really interested in doing that kind of stuff because of the amount of work involved, you're then kind of stuffed when you're trying to find all this information out. So what I would caution is when it gets done, make sure you get copies, both digital and print if you can't get a digital, because otherwise those records will just be gone, because they don't necessarily, they are based on a login. So like anything. So what I would say is try and be aware of all of this. Try and make sure there are extra copies, and make sure you're backing up stuff. I usually have learned over the years of losing photos and various other things via digital copies to back up in multiple sources, multiple places, and to double check everything, make sure they all still exist, because otherwise you can have trouble. So DNA testing and DNA program. So it's a fairly simple issue. You pay money. That's where it all starts. It's not cheap. It's around $100 depending on the organization, sometimes more, sometimes less. Again, your mileage and cost will vary on currency and various other things and location. So keep that in mind. What ends up happening is they then send you out a box. The box has a little tube in it. The tube says, please spit in me until you get to certain levels. And it's really fun and great. And you can't eat before, I think it's like a half an hour before, so that they get the best genetic copy. Obviously, it doesn't get mixed up with whatever you're eating. So make sure that's taken care of. I know this is all nitty gritty stuff that they'll tell you, but just keep in mind. And so for me, that was kind of what I had to do. And then you mail that back to them, and that's where your DNA comes from. So that's what they're testing with. So they then take that and do all their testing with that. And for me, that process took, I believe I sent it in, when was it? I think it was at the beginning of March. And it took all of March, all of April. I had got back my results towards the first week in May. And so it was not quick, I will say that. But they were good in that they told you what was going on all the way through. They gave you an estimated time, but the estimated time turned out to be wrong. But they did warn me that that could be the case, that basically what we might see is that the time, because they have, as it says in their automated setup, they've had a lot of applications, da-di-da-di-da. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, obviously. And so that was the process I went through. Then I logged into, they would send you a link to click on, you log into that, and then you have your results. And the results are quite interesting. They're very diverse for me anyway, in some respects, and very narrow in others, which was really, really fascinating. So we'll flip a little bit so you can kind of see this. And you can see what the results were for me. I am not bothered about showing that. This is pretty obvious. And like I said, my last name kind of gives some of it away. So so if you look at these, I can explain pretty much all of it. So my family moved out to Ontario, which is over here, on both sides eventually. And that's where I was born, was in that area. So that's an important thing to know about. But the key is this right here, for obvious reasons. And if you look at the percentages, and if we go through this, you'll see something interesting. For me, anyway, it was very interesting. 53% Welsh. Which is kind of funny because I should only be 50% Welsh. So there's a small percentage of Welsh in my mother's side of the family. Whether that's an accurate measurement or just a little variation problem, I don't know. But I think it's very fascinating that there was any. So it actually tilts me even more so. And my sister, who had it done as well, which thankfully, this is the other thing. If you lose track of stuff like that, you can actually, if you get yours done, they actually give you a comparison with other people who are in your genetic family tree. And she was one of the people that came up. So I was able to look at hers. And with the exception of a couple of items, we were almost identical on most things, which I thought was really fascinating. So again, 53% Welsh, not surprising. I think this is fascinating because they literally pinpoint the area of Wales where my family is from, which is Anglesey, Gwynedd, and the Wrexham area, but mostly in this side of the line than that side of the line. There's probably one or two that lived in Wrexham and East Clwyd, but I would argue that most of my family tree is probably originating around the Llŷn Peninsula because that's where they were from. And as far as I've been able to go back, that's where almost every one of them is from. So we'll go into some of the further details about this and what this might mean, but I think that's fascinating. Reasons why it's fascinating. One, it shows that lineage goes back there and it's obvious. The other thing which I found fascinating is Irish content is small, which means that that area genetically was probably not, at least my family doesn't come from Irish ancestry in any recent past, which is interesting. The Scottish one, this is the weird one because that one, with my sister's side, Scotland was below England, and it was about the similar percentage points. So that's within the statistical error point. So I think that's fascinating too. And then below that, of course, so you have England. And again, this is also interesting. It says Northwest England, which is interesting, and Northern Wales, and also Northern Wales to Manchester. But the funny side of that is that my mum's family mostly comes from the eastern side of England, at least as far as we know, specifically in the area around Norfolk. And so it's kind of weird to suddenly have the English stuff be all sort of near the border countries. So I don't know what's going on there, but one of the reasons why I wonder about this is because of the last three, which is Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, which To be blunt, probably points to Vikings. And if you're talking about the area around Norfolk, you're talking about the area of East Anglia, which was, of course, part of the Danelaw in the old-timey times. So that is another fascinating result of all this, is that you have that kind of thing going on. So certainly the percentages for me are 6-3. If you're listening to this on podcast, just to kind of clarify, 53% Welsh. Scotland was 19%. England, Northwest Europe was 18%. The funny thing is, when they map this out, there is only England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland as the main, and then it was Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, although no reference to any of that Iceland ancestry. So I think that's just a marker for Nordic peoples, which makes some sense. Like I said, if there is some intermingling within my mom's side, it would not shock me by any sense of the imagination. Again, going back to confused information, I actually thought that my mother's maiden name was based on an old Norse name, but it's actually an old Anglo-Saxon name. So it isn't Norse, which is also kind of interesting. And also kind of points to the fact that her family wasn't largely Norman, which is also quite interesting. In fact, the fact that there's no French in my DNA results at all, like French location, is also quite interesting. I mean, it doesn't shock me when it talks about it from the Ontario side of things or the Canada side of things, because my family's lineage, my grandparents moved over from Wales, so there isn't going to be a linkage to anybody outside of that family grouping. Then my mother's side of the family had lived in Ontario pretty much for about 110, 120 years by the time that they met up with my dad. And they had been some of the very first settlers in that area of Ontario in moving up with English people who were leaving due to either free land in Canada or in opposition to the War of Independence. Little fun side effect is one of my family tree lineages has both the Daughters of Independence and Daughters of the Empire Loyalists. So on both sides. So it's a interesting little dichotomy that kind of comes up, which I find fascinating. But what it does show is that there's not a lot of American settlement here, which makes perfect sense for obvious reasons. And it also shows that there isn't any main European, no France, no Spain, no Germany, none of that, which is curious for my mom's side, because you would have thought that maybe some of the German would leak in because of the Anglo-Saxon lineage, but it doesn't seem to show up, at least on this DNA test. Now, does this DNA test 100% prove that all of this is true? No, and that's something to keep in mind. These are only as good as the technology will allow, and this is public technology. It's not like a university's level of technology. So you're not going to have highly accurate indications of everything. It's cool to look at, and it's fun to kind of look at, and it does largely point to some things I've thought about for a long time, which is that there is in my own family tree certain specific things I expect to see. One is Welsh, one is English, and I expect to probably see Viking ancestry or Nordic ancestry in there due to the Viking invasions of England, and where the family tree kind of resides is in that area. And what this might point to, in fact, because there's no Germanic names in here and no Germanic percentages, is that maybe my mother's family's English ancestry is actually a Viking ancestry, and that's why it's creeping in this way. But it's hard to say, because at 18% for England and Northwest Europe, that might literally be the Germanic. It's just not showing it on the mapping, because, of course, if they're Anglo-Saxon, then that would be where that's coming from. So reality says they're probably Anglo-Saxons, and so you have a large percentage of that and a large percentage of this. Why there's Scottish ancestry, I'm not really sure, because I don't know of a close line of Scottish ancestors, but I could be wrong. So I'm not sure. We haven't gone far enough back to be accurate on that. But it wouldn't surprise me either, because of course these islands are very small, and intermingling happens. So there may have been people who married in who were Scottish that came down into England, and we wouldn't necessarily know that for sure at this point. Hopefully we'll figure that out as time goes on, and that'll kind of verify. Like, what you want to see happening is you want to see your DNA and family history kind of backing each other up, because the more it backs each other up, the more accurate both are. And that's something that's very important. Is accuracy is key, much like it is for history. The more accurate you are in history, the more accurate things will be for you in general when you're doing this kind of research. So you do want to have these things double checked and looked into, and hopefully ensure that they are accurate as best as you possibly can. And I totally recommend doing these kind of things, because the expense might turn you off, and that's perfectly understandable. But I do think if you're doing family history and you're getting stumped, it is one way to kind of confirm some things, so that when you're searching, okay, I don't have to look over here, because that's not a lineage that I need to run down necessarily. So if you have some story about, like, example again, let's go back to the Native American example. There was a lot of people running around saying, oh, I'm 1/50th Native American. Well, you find out very quickly, oh, no, you're not. Like, for example, there is no lineage of mine that goes into Native American, not even a percentage point. And I mean, I have 1% Irish in my lineage. So that being the case, then it's probably pretty unlikely there's going to be a 50th great-grandparent that happens to be a Native American. And so that's something to keep in mind. And remember that family stories aren't history, and you have to be skeptical of them until you find evidence of them. And that's as true for historians as it is for family historians. Everybody has those stories that are told about various people in various places that may or may not be accurate, and you need to double check and you need to confirm. And once you do, I think you'll find that everything will work a lot better. So with all of that said and done, thank you guys for listening and watching today. I hope you have a great day. Please be sure to check this out on YouTube if you want to see a picture of this actual genealogy. This goes up on YouTube as well as an audio podcast. You can find that at youtube.com/at Welsh History Podcast. And of course, you can find everything I do at Welsh History Podcast, via Twitter at Welsh History Pod, Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast, or on Patreon. If you are so inclined, you can help with funding for research and for the books that I use for this research, and you can do that at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all for listening, watching, and everything you do. You are tremendous. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.